Right? And so now, the three of us are going to just briefly talk about things that we might be thinking about with this experiment, and thinking about best practices. So first one, the one that I didn't write here, that in hindsight I wish we had written, is thinking clearly about what are the learning objectives of the experiment. And so for me, one of the biggest learning objectives that I have for this experiment is reinforcing this positive claim that perfectly competitive markets find this price that equates supply and demand. Because for many students, it's like, okay, like why, yes, I can find P star, Q star, but understanding, that this price-taking behavior is sort of what's driving competitive markets to find this equilibrium price. For me, that's really important. And so notice in discussing the results, I didn't really talk much about quantity. For me, I focused on price. What do I need to do in preparation for the experiment? Well, I went, I had to make sure that I had my materials done, and so that's going to be really important. I made sure that I had the graphs done for equilibrium price and quantity, although I should have remembered exactly what the equilibrium price was. That would have been good. And in this case, I will say that I did not do this. This experiment is inspired by the market experiment in Bergstrom and Miller's experiment with economic principles. Bergstrom and Miller wrote a book in 1997 that was well ahead of its time, and basically they proposed that we could teach the entire microeconomics principles course just by using experiments. And it's a great resource if you want to run experiments in the classroom. And so for me, there were things about their experiment I didn't fully love, but having their recipe, I was able to adapt it to my own uses. The other thing, and another reason why we ran this workshop, is Rachel and I are experimental economists, and traditionally a very large fraction of the econ instructors who have used experiments in their classrooms have been people who run experiments in their research. And there's a lot of best practices that Rachel and I, as Rachel said, what does she do in an experiment? She does exactly what her advisor told her to do, and we're indoctrinated in good practices of running experiments that we don't even think about, but for you guys who haven't run experiments, or many of you haven't run experiments, there are things that aren't necessarily obvious. And so if I'm going to pick one huge lesson learned, it's going to be the absolute importance of relatively clear instructions. I cannot stress it enough. I've had the opportunity to visit a bunch of classrooms in which instructors are running experiments. And if there's one predictor about whether an experiment is going to go well or an experiment is going to go poorly, often in the quest for efficiency, an instructor will rush through the instructions, and the result is students really have no idea what they're doing. And perhaps in my rush through instructions, I didn't fully make it clear that if your value is $6.05 selling for $10 is not a good thing, But in general, having clear instructions, I think, is one of the biggest thing that you can do to make sure that the experiment works out as reasonably well.
I'm going to piggyback on that.
Yeah.
And is it okay if I steal the mic?
Yeah.
In addition to having clear instructions for the students, another really essential component to having successful classroom experiments is to have a clear protocol or background set of instructions for yourself. So Bob knew that he was going to show up, he was going to have these cards, he knew when the cards were going to be passed out to each of you, and he knew how he was going to go about handling possible mistakes that might go on. So how do I talk about the data with my students if things don't quite match up the way I want?
Yeah. And I have to say, one of the good things about this experiment, almost always,
the data looks great.
The data always looks great. And I guess the one thing that the one on-the-fly decision that I had was, do I run a third round? And so this is where having a little bit of flexibility. After 2 rounds, it was pretty clear you guys figured out what the equilibrium price was. Round 3 would have been a waste. Right? And the final thing that I want to reiterate is the research is really strong. Like, running experiments is cool and great, and I think there is a benefit to having students making decisions as if they are economic decision makers, and I think that has a benefit of itself. The research, however, is pretty strong that to get the most student learning out of student participation in experiments, there's got to be some follow-up reflection on this. And so for me, when I run this experiment, it's all about a small group assignment where students get together and talk about the choices that we made. As we go on, we'll talk about some other things.
I'll add a number one
Yeah.
too, and I think part of clear instructions is having visual instructions. I think it's easy to tell someone something and assume that they picked up everything. And I think having pictures, having bullet points or something that students can see and remember, and having those instructions up while you're running could be very helpful.
Yeah.
But we also don't want to make it so that if you don't have it all figured out and clear, that you should not run an experiment, because that's not what we're trying to get at. It's just one of those things where you want to have an idea going into it, that it's not just on the fly, let's try this. Plan. Yeah.
Planning is important.
This is a version of, I think, the original Vernon Smith
Yes.
oral auction, so there's different versions out there. I found it interesting that you seem to have done it after you covered all this material. And most people, I thought, did it as a motivation, maybe right before supply and demand, and introducing the notions of surplus
So
and how-
we're gonna talk all about this placement in our next best
Okay.
Yeah,
practice.
With
but
best practices.
But I do think that but in what I'd say right now is yes, and this would be a great experiment where if you asked 20 instructors who use the market experiment, there's going to be a diversity of opinion on before versus after. And at least for me, right, it's all about what is the learning objective that I want, right? And for me, the learning objective I want is having introduced this in a hand-waving way, right, that perfectly competitive markets find the price that equates supply and demand, right? In essence, I want to use the experiment to prove to students that under situations, right, whereas I do think other instructors will say, right, I'm going to use this experiment and then I am going to build supply and demand off of that. And I couldn't agree more that both ways, And we'll talk more about the before versus after later. Other questions, comments, concerns?
I'm going to chime in with one more comment. So one concern that I had before I started running in my classroom, and I've heard other people have, is the concern about time. And so there are some time savers that you can do. So if you're on bullet point 2 about what we should do or have students do before the experiment, you can assign the instructions and have the students read the instructions before the experiment. This does come with the trade-off where you don't know how much attention they've necessarily paid, but you can alleviate some of those concerns about attention by adding a simple instructions quiz at the beginning of class or in your course management system.
Yeah, and I will reiterate that the thing that you don't want to do is assign the instructions before class and assume that your students have, because we know they will not have read it. But a successful way is, right, in essence, having them read the instructions, right, having them take a brief quiz in your learning management system or something, and then when you get to class, then you're just able to
Go bullet points, like remember, here are the key points about what we're
exactly,
doing.
and then thank you. Yeah.
How much time would you
Yeah.
dedicate to this experiment? Three rounds, instructions, and then debriefing in a classroom setting.
Okay.
Debriefing, it's going to vary. I debrief some in my homework even, so I don't necessarily do all of my debrief in the classroom. The instructions in the experiment itself, I would say mine is about 15 to 20 minutes. I don't know about yours, Bob or Kelvin.
Yeah. So when I currently use this experiment, I actually have my teaching assistants do it in tutorials, and between the instructions, the experiment, and the debriefing, I just give full 50 minutes for this. But I will do a demand shift.